Greetings, everyone. My name is Katsiaryna Shmatsina. I'm a foreign policy analyst, so not a journalist, but I do regularly communicate with media and give some comments and political analysis. And today I will try to talk about COVID and what's going on in Belarus and how it's being covered in Belarusian media. And I guess that the unorthodox or like a very creative approach of our government towards tackling the coronavirus and explaining the population why the quarantine is not needed at all. Like it was actually in the news, all over the news, and I got a bunch of emails from my American friends who were saying like, oh, we've read about you, like your country in Washington Post when president says that it's okay to play hockey and drink vodka and there is no coronavirus there. So yeah, and let's jump to the presentation.
Yes.
So I just want to make a quick introduction into Belarusian sort of political environment in which the journalists operate. And then I want to emphasize that even like when we talk about international relations or politics, I would say that COVID just underlined, it did not change that much the environment in the society and politics, but it just underlined the existing problems and the conflicting interests. And the same thing sort of happened in the media environment in Belarus, where the talk about COVID was just another occasion for both Belarusian state media and independent media to argue about political debates and to criticize the regime and to criticize each other. And I will explain this in a minute. And then what's happening, what else is happening is that when the government is trying to contain the panic about the COVID, this is happening, and then there are government statements that everything is just fine. We have a very few patients with this diagnosis and everything is under control. At the same time, there is quite a limited access to the official data statistics by the Ministry of Health. And the journalists are complaining about this, about the limited access they can get or some confirmations from the press services of the ministry, or they do not always have the opportunity to get the official comments or some comments by the representatives of the hospitals. And then at the same time, this pandemic situation serves a fertile ground for, again, political debates and speculations. At the background of this limited information, when there is limited official information, then other actors could jump in and speculate on this. And then there is this foreign disinformation efforts, and this is covered pretty much widely, like we talk a lot about the foreign disinformation conducted by Russia in Europe, but also these efforts could be seen and traced in Belarus. And then there are a bunch of, well, a few political events upcoming, such as presidential elections in August this year, which also put some pressure and limitations on what's going on about the media coverage. And then could I have next slide, please?
It's on.
Oh, okay, thank you. And so essentially I've selected, or like if you generalize the media landscape, I've selected three main media or three media types: state, independent, and pro-Russian networks. And then I'll explain this in a minute. And then essentially those separate media types spread and formulate three different narratives. And I just want to explain, I guess, like with the state media, it's quite clear what that is, what type of media, like controlled or owned by the state. Then talking about independent media, I mean the Belarusian-based and those financed in Belarus, and also some foreign media services like, let's say, Current Time or Deutsche Welle, Belarusian service, or let's say BISS.CEE, a Polish-based TV channel that works for Belarus. And then we can call them independent, but some, for instance, like Russian propaganda label them as the opposition media and some agents of like foreign influence, stuff like that. And then when we talk about pro-Russian media, this could be the media like Sputnik and those who have national outreach. And then there is a web of regional pro-Russian networks that sort of pretend to be Belarusian-inspired media outlets, but there is a bunch of journalists and expert investigations that show that they are created, financed by Russian agents. I mean, some Russian actors and organizations. Next slide, please.
Hey.
Hey, yeah, thanks. And then we talk about the state media narratives. I'll be referring to a recent media monitoring study, and then by Andrei Yeliseyev, that's a Belarusian political analyst, and he was monitoring those media narratives for quite a while. So state media narratives essentially reinforce the government course of action, and they explicitly praise the President Lukashenko's choice not to introduce quarantine, and they sometimes even say that the world leaders follow the Belarusian advice. They figured out that the Belarusian, that it is not a good idea to stop the economy, to bear the economic losses, and it's a good decision to carry on business as usual. And then there is a bunch of messages that mock at the COVID, and here I put an interesting quote, something like, "The European waves of pandemic were crashed into the Belarusian river," and like some other ridiculous statements like that. And then when those media, both TV and printed outlets, when they report on the COVID death victims, they emphasize that the patient was old and had a bunch of chronic diseases, therefore like trying to diminish the role of the COVID factor in those sad statistics. And then there's a bunch of statements that declare that the Belarusian healthcare system is good and prepared to tackle the crisis, and that they follow the recommendations of the World Health Organization. And then again, there is a lot of debate in the society whether we need a quarantine. And what the state media try to formulate is that they introduce the so-called false dilemma. They would say that there is only one choice, or only two options. And one is a good one and another is a bad one, which it means like if we stop the economy and introduce the quarantine, this would eventually mean a crash of the economy, loss of jobs, and then the enterprises would be sold by some speculative entrepreneurs, and people will lose jobs, and this will be like very bad, while the government knows the right solution, essentially. Hey. And then when we talk about independent media, they produce a different set of narratives and information. And then here I would again emphasize that at the background, when the official statistics is not widely available, and the society has a sense that the officials sort of cover up or limit, try to diminish the scope of COVID spread in Belarus. It brings a fertile ground for speculations. Is this that bad? How many actual deaths do we have? Do doctors introduce, or like, do they diagnose the right diagnosis, or they try to cover the statistics? And then in that context, the society has the expectation for the independent media to get a better understanding of what's going on. And independent media can fulfill this gap, or to respond to this request to provide unbiased reporting. Indeed, some media outlets, well, I would say from watching what they do, I would say they're, and knowing some journalists on the ground who travel around the country risking their health, trying to get some information, comments from what's going on in the regions. They try to do their best work, and some media provide a platform for some patients or patients slash journalists who were having COVID symptoms, and they went to the hospital and then sort of provided the insights of how the hospital and medical system works. What are the flaws? What are the good sides of it? So independent media provides sort of a voice and articulate the voice of the society at the background of state, of the limited information by the state. But also, what I wanted to say, but there are certain flaws and like limitations to this kind of reporting, because, well, depending on the preferences of the editorial board, depending on a specialization of a given media, some would be tempted to blame for everything the political regime, or to put, instead of quality reporting what's going on, they would just put at the background a picture of President Lukashenko and say like, oh, here's the bad dictator and he's to blame for everything. Or they could be tempting to give a voice to ask the to have an interview with a relative of COVID victim, and this could create a sort of a distorted picture of what's going on, and the material is not always the most unbiased, but it's sort of just skews the picture, but in the other way. And I would also, again, underline the challenging environment in which those independent media work, because due to the peculiarities of the Belarusian political system, where the media, independent media and journalists sometimes face state control and prosecution for their activities. And this is happening not only during the COVID times, but before that. And then this is another challenge for the journalists operating on the ground and trying to report as unbiased as possible. And then the next slide, please. And then when we talk about pro-Russian media, I've already mentioned that there is a bunch of those who work nationally. They have national coverage and a bunch of regional media. And I've been monitoring them for a while before the pandemics on different occasions, such as parliamentary elections or the Russian-Belarusian integration talks. And I can compare how they cover this particular situation with COVID compared to other significant events. And then I would say that they use the same tactics, and just for a different occasion. I mean, a few months ago, these were parliamentary elections. Now there is COVID, and the tactics are similar. And I would explain which ones. So in general, when we look at the news sections of those outlets, they provide more or less unbiased and fair coverage of what state officials said what the World Health Organization recommended to Belarus. And they don't do much reporting. They don't have this need and specialization. They won't travel like somewhere middle of nowhere to interview people in a hospital or to provide some report like that. They would just rather repost information from other outlets. But what they do, the major portion of their narratives is concentrated into the blogs and op-ed section. And that's where they traditionally write about conspiracy theories, about the evil West, the good Russia, and they also use the virtually any situation to criticize Belarusian political opposition, civil society activists, environment activists, virtually anyone who is who represents this Belarusian civil society and who does not have the pro-Russian sentiments. And so in that regard, the COVID situation became just another occasion for them to spread their narratives. And again, like if you just cut this word COVID and insert the word anti-integration protests, essentially like the message would be the same, just the occasion is different. And then the last slide, please. Speaking of what should be done, what is missing, I have one observation which is fair not only for Belarus, but for other countries as well. Unfortunately, like when we talk about pandemics, crisis, about people's life and health, it becomes when media talk about it, when there is a wide discussion about it, sometimes it becomes not so much or not exclusively about protecting people's life and spreading information how to tackle the crisis, but it becomes a fertile ground for speculations, and different forces, political actors try to capitalize on it. And then again, when it comes to Belarus, there is a very complicated challenge when the official information is missing, and then the journalists and people in general have problems with access to the official information and to get the fair understanding of what's going on in the country. I don't have a solution for these two challenges. I mean, it takes more than, I mean, if there was a simple solution, I mean, I wish we could all formulate it right away. But I will mention something that the journalist community can do, and something that could improve the reporting standards. And again, here I won't reinvent the wheel. I will refer to the recommendations and the recommendations that are published by the Belarusian journalist community, by the Association of Journalists and Press Club Belarus. And I would say that that's a great thing that they do formulate those recommendations and raise those important issues and critically review the work of journalists reporting and working in Belarus today. And they have a bunch of recommendations and the checklist of what are the good journalist practices in the time of COVID, how to check the sources, how to protect the anonymous sources, if that's, let's say, a doctor in a hospital who does not want to discover his identity. And then that's another issue. It could be tempting to interview just any doctor who would sort of exaggerate the picture of COVID panic and the problems, but maybe it's a better idea to find a competent medical expert, not just like any medical or healthcare worker who could comment on the situation when you prepare an article. And then from what another recommendation those like Press Club Belarus, for instance, had, was to be careful with using the comments of relatives of alleged COVID victims, because again, like when the person dies, of course this is sad, and like if that happens in a hospital, but then there should be a more check on, like fact check on why this happened, not maybe just listen to the relatives of the victims and insert those purely potentially emotional comments, and not just the trying to obtain a full picture. So I guess I will stop here, and I'll be happy to continue at the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you.